Hey y'all. So today we are focusing on a sentence on page 7 of Farewell to Manzanar. And this sentence helps us to address our learning target, which is I can analyze how the author makes connections among and distinctions between individuals, ideas, or events in Farewell to Manzanar. So Sorry, y'all. The sentence for today is he was suddenly a man with no rights who looked exactly like the enemy. So, what does this sentence mean? What is this sentence about? To start us on our language dive today, take about 30 seconds and just write what you think this sentence means. Okay, so keep in mind this is your thought. So there really isn't a wrong answer. Whatever you have is suitable. So let's look at our first chunk. It says, who looked exactly like the enemy? So, whom is this chunk describing? And you thought right. The chunk is describing her papa, right? This is the man that they are talking about. And so the next question is, well, can you figure out which noun phrase in the sentence the relative pronoun who is replacing? Who is the pronoun? I'm sorry. Which noun phrase in the sentence is who replacing? Keep in mind, who looked exactly like the enemy is the phrase is the part of the sentence that we're focusing on. So this means it is replacing a man with no right, which in this sentence refers to Papa. Now, as we move into our second chunk, keep in mind that relative clauses usually begin with that, which, who, or where. And these words replace the subject of a clause, which is the noun or noun phrase that comes directly before the relative clause. And remember, relative clauses describe the noun or noun phrase that they follow. So, why do you think the authors used a relative clause to provide this description? Okay, so looking at the chunk, it says, he was suddenly a man with no rights. The man with no rights looked exactly like the enemy. So, using the relative clause, of course, that relative clause starts with who. In this case, it allows the author to make their writing more concise, more to the point. They could have used two sentences like you see here. However, it would have been choppy and hard to read. The first sentence that I read sounds definitely more straight to the point and it's easier to understand. Now, either way that it's written, there is a simile in the chunk. Take 10 seconds to see if you can find where that simile is and write down how do you know. Okay. So most of you probably got that. It is like the enemy. And we know that because of the word like. Remember, guys, a simile compares two things using like or as, right? It is that comparison of two things using like or as. And so the word like definitely helps it to stand out. Now, who is this enemy that Papa is being compared to? Think about the context of the story that we are reading. Who would be the enemy? Somebody that is not a friend that Papa would be compared to. And this was during World War II. And at that time, the United States was fighting with Japan. So the enemy that they're referring to is the Japanese. Now, let's put the sentence back together the way it originally was. And it reads, he was suddenly a man with no rights who looked exactly like the enemy. So, what if we move the relative clause? Remember, it starts with the who looked exactly like the enemy somewhere else in the sentence. Okay, so the thing is, it would be grammatical to move the relative clause after he, but the purpose of the clause, of the relative clause, sorry, y'all, is to give us more information specifically about why Papa was a man with no rights. A relative clause must follow the noun or noun phrase that it describes, right? So, who looked exactly like the enemy? He was suddenly a man with no rights. He who was suddenly a man with no rights looked exactly like the enemy is fine grammatically, but we do want to make sure that we are using our relative clauses correctly. Now, this sentence helps us to understand the causes of Japanese American internment and why. How does this sentence help us to understand the causes of Japanese American internment? Now, for that, you are definitely going to have to draw on what you have learned so far about what is going on during World War II at this moment and draw on what you know from reading the novel. Take 30 seconds to think about that. Okay, and as you guessed it, he looks like the people that they were fighting. So, sadly enough, this happened, and the authors compare Papa to the enemy to help the reader understand the historical context. Japanese Americans at this time because of, sorry, had to fix that. Because of the heritage and appearance were often viewed as enemies to the United States. So when we use description and similes, it helps to enhance many things in our speaking and writing. So I want for you to answer however you think, but how can we use description and similes in our speaking and writing? I want you to take a second to think about, what did the simile in this sentence do for you? What did it help us to be able to do? And go ahead and jot that down. And I'll give you 10 seconds, but if you need more time, pause the video and take as much time as needed. And once you're done with that, scroll back up to the top and look at what you thought the whole sentence. He was suddenly a man with no rights who looked exactly like the enemy first met, and go all the way down to the exact same sentence and jot down, what do you think the meaning of this sentence is now? Keep in mind everything that we discussed during our language dive that helps us to understand a sentence, and take some time to look at your original answer and go back and see if it changed or if you still think the same thing. Write down the answer that you think is correct. I'm going to give you about 15 seconds, but if you need more time, pause the video and take as much time as you need to answer the question. What do you think is the meaning of this sentence? And the last thing is, let's practice these relative clauses with a simile inside of it, right? So practice. Describe someone using a relative clause with a simile inside of it. Guys, please keep in mind that a relative clause usually begins with that, which, who, or where. We're going to focus on who, but just in case you wanted to be a little different. For example, I might say, my sister is someone who swims like a fish. She loves the water.